In this video I'm going to introduce you to the for loop. So far in class we've used while loops, and we've used if statements, but we haven't used for loops. And for loops are very important in programming, and we're going to see how these work. You use some of the same logic, and they're actually very similar to while loops, but they work a little bit differently, so let's take a look. I'm going to start with a while loop just to refresh our memory on how those work, and then I'm going to change it into a for loop. So before we made a simple program where we had a few integers, one was called sum and the other one was called counter, and we created a while loop to allow the user to input numbers and add them up and save them in a sum. So I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to need to import my keyboard reader class, import terminal IO keyboard reader, and then I'm going to need to declare a keyboard reader, and I'm going to call it reader, so I'm naming my variable reader, and I'll initialize it right away, so equals new keyboard reader. And now I'm going to use that keyboard reader down here to read in as I go through my while loop. And my while loop is going to look like this. While, and then my condition is as long as the counter is less than 5. If the counter is less than 5, I'll continue going through the while loop. And let's set my counter initially to be 1, or let's go with 0. The counter is 0 initially, and the sum is 0 initially. And so every time through the while loop, I'm going to say sum equals sum plus counter, and then I'm going to increment my counter. Counter equals counter plus 1. So every time through the while loop, my sum is going to grow, okay, because I'm going to increase it by whatever the counter is, and then my counter will also grow because I'm going to increase it by 1. At the end, I'm going to print out my answer. And if I run this program, it should compute the sum all the way up. Okay, import that keyboard reader. I'm going to comment that out for now because I don't actually need it. I haven't incorporated it yet, nor have I used that keyboard reader. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Right now, my program is too simple. I'm not even using user input, so we'll get back to that in a minute. And if I run my program, I get 10. So what it did is the first time through, sum was 0, and it added 0 plus 0. Next time through, though, my counter was bigger, so it did 0 plus 1. Okay, save that value to sum. And the next time through, it did 1 plus 2, and the sum kept growing until the counter was greater, or until the sum was not less than 4 anymore, at which point we ended the loop and printed it out. Now I can rewrite this whole thing as a for loop, and we'll incorporate user input later, but as a for loop it would look different. So I'm going to simply put my big block comments here. So if I do /* and then after this whole while loop I'm going to do */. That way we can look at this later if we need it. And in its place, I'm going to do a for loop, and a for loop looks like this. I say for, and then inside of my where the condition would be for the while loop, I've really got 3 parts, and they're separated by semicolons. So I'm going to go ahead and put my semicolons in there right away. The first part, I have to say what the initial value is for my counter, and so a for loop kind of has that counter idea built right into it. And so I'm going to continue using my variable called counter, okay, and I'm not even going to set the value of it up here because I'm going to set the value right here, which is what you do in a for loop. So I'm going to say counter equals 0. So that's what goes in that first slot, and then in between the next two semicolons, this is where I put my condition. So I'm going to say as long as counter is less than a certain value, in this case 5, and then over here is where I say the increment. So in this case I'm going to say counter equals counter plus 1. Okay, now this, it's just very important to realize it's got these three parts. So I set my counter to 0, and then the middle part is specifying the condition, and then the last part is specifying how my counter increments. And I could have used a different variable besides counter. I could have called it anything else, and it would have worked just the same. So now inside of the for loop, it basically works exactly the same as before. I'm going to do sum equals sum plus counter. Okay, and then at the very end I've still got my system.out.println for the sum. So if I run this program, it should do the same as before. Good, it printed out 10. And if we traced through the for loop, we would have traced through 5 times. So the first time through the loop, counter was 0. The second time through the loop, counter was 1. Third time through the loop, counter was 2. Fourth time through, counter was 3. And the fifth time through, counter was 4. But then the sixth time through, counter was 5. And it never would have gone inside the loop because 5 is not less than 5. And so we would have broken outside of the for loop. Okay, but let's not stop there. Let's try a slightly more complicated example. What we're going to do for this one is bring out a little bit of user input and allow this program to calculate averages. So let's see if I can get this to work now. I'm not sure why it wasn't compiling either earlier. Terminal IO keyboard reader. The error is the terminal IO cannot be resolved. And perhaps I got rid of my folders. So if I go in, I'm working in my Java examples folder, and I accidentally deleted my folders, so I'm going to need to get those back. I have copies of them here, so I'm just going to grab them quickly. There they are. And I'm going to go back and put them in my Java examples folder. And there they are. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, good. Now it compiles. And I'm going to uncomment the line where I declared and initialized my keyboard reader. And now inside of the for loop, I'm going to use it. So instead of adding to the counter, I'm not going to actually use that counter anymore for mathematical purposes. The counter is only going to, the only purpose it's going to serve now is to make sure that I only go through the loop the correct number of times. So in this case, I'm going to put a comment here. Go through a loop 5 times. Okay? So it doesn't. The only purpose of the counter then is just to make sure that I go through this loop 5 times. That's it. And now each time through the loop, I'm going to do sum equals sum plus, and then I'm going to ask the user for input on the value I want to add to the sum. So reader.read line, and actually I'm going to do .read int. And so every time through that loop, I'll be prompted for input. So first time through, I'm going to put a I'm going to do 4. Next time through, I'm going to do 8, 10, 12, and 14. And so if I find the average of these numbers, it should be pretty obvious that the average will be 10. Okay. So the total, if I add them up, is 48. Now to compute the average, let's do the average. Instead of printing out sum, I'm going to do sum divided by counter. Okay. And so as we said the last time through the loop, counter should be 5. When the loop was evaluated to false, so when this condition failed for the first time, when it evaluated to false, counter was 5. So if I'm doing sum divided by counter, which should be 5. Let's try it. I'll do the same problem. 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. And when it adds them all up and divides by 5, I get 10 as my average, which is what I expected. Okay. that concludes the video on for loops. They're very powerful, and what's great about them is that you can very easily specify how many times you want to iterate through a loop. In this case, I knew that since I started at 0 and I went up to when the counter would be less than 5, that it was going to take me exactly 5 times to go through that loop. But I could have also been a little fancier. Instead of incrementing the counter by 1 every time, I could have incremented by 2, or 3, or 4, or 5, and that would have made things more complicated. But this was just meant to serve as an introduction to how to use a for loop.